Well, we're in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 11 today, and we learn the new problem Paul's going to address in this chapter in verse 12, the second part of verse 12, where he says, "How do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead?" We've talked about this before, but the Greco-Romans thought the idea of our bodies being raised from the dead in the end was absolutely absurd because of their Greek dualistic thought that the body is evil and wicked and the soul is good and pure. And ultimately, our goal in their eyes is for our souls to be set free from our bodies. Our bodies are really just prisons for our souls, tombs for our souls. And we want to escape this horrible trap that keeps our souls trapped in this sinful shell, essentially. And so the idea that our bodies would resurrect in the end, that is just absurd to them. And plus, if our bodies raised from the dead, well, what is that even going to look like? Are they going to be like zombies? This is another thing that they're wrestling with in verse 35 in this chapter. Someone will say, "How are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come?" Are you just going to be resuscitated with all of your, scars and injuries, and maybe you're missing an arm, and so you're going to be missing an arm there, or what if you're just dust? I mean, how in the world is your body at that point going to be resurrected from the dead? The whole idea is just absurd, and I think people today still struggle with the resurrection of the body for those same reasons. But again, the Corinthians, they are importing the human wisdom of their culture. They're taking the way that their culture thinks about the resurrection, and some of them at least are importing that into the church. And Jesus was very clear that there's going to be a bodily resurrection in the end. And Paul, in this chapter, what he's going to argue is, if you think that the bodily resurrection in the end is impossible, well, that would mean you'd have to deny Jesus's resurrection. You'd have to say that Jesus did not rise bodily from the grave. And by the way, there were false teachers saying that he didn't, especially in the 2nd century. The Gnostics, they had that Greek dualism concept, and so they presented Jesus as raising from the dead, but only spiritually. And he was sort of like a phantom, and so he would walk on the beach and he wouldn't leave any footprints because he was just a spirit. That's so far from what Christianity teaches. He rose bodily from the grave, and this opening section in verses 1 through 11 is to prove that point, to make sure the Corinthians remember not only that Jesus did rise bodily from the grave, but that the Corinthians actually believed that message when they were first saved. It is upon that message of Jesus' bodily resurrection that their whole salvation is based, that the whole church there in Corinth has been built. And so to deny Jesus' bodily resurrection is to basically undercut their entire faith and to pull the rug right out under themselves as a church and to illegitimize themselves as a church. And so Paul reminds them, verse 1, "I make known to you the gospel which I preached to you." Now he's speaking past tense, as in when he was first with them, which would have been around, again, 51 AD or so, 21 years after Jesus' resurrection, roughly. And he says, you guys believe that message that I preached to you. The good news that Jesus rose from the dead. You believe that. And that was the basis upon which you stand and upon which you are still being saved. There's a salvation in a couple senses. There's their past salvation, but there's also the continuing salvation of their souls as they continue to be holy and to model their lives off of Jesus and to rid themselves of their sinful habits. It's still upon the basis of the resurrection of Jesus that they're making those changes in their lives. So I think Paul is arguing this because none of the Corinthians actually did doubt Jesus rose bodily from the grave. I think Paul is just jumping on what they all already know. They know Jesus rose from the grave bodily. In fact, that's why they became Christians in the first place. That is the message that saved them. But now he's just trying to get them in this chapter to connect the dots and say, okay, if you believe that Jesus really did rise from the dead, well then, why would you think it's impossible for our bodies to raise in the end? If Jesus' body raised, why would you think our bodies couldn't raise from the dead? So we'll get into that more as we continue this week. But in verse 2, Paul's telling them you need to hold on to what you first believed about Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And if now you're changing your tune about the resurrection in the end, and you're thinking that the bodily resurrection in the end is impossible, well, by implication, you would be saying that Jesus' bodily resurrection was impossible, which means what you believed at the very start when you became Christians, it's all for nothing now. Now it's all in vain, he says. And so in the rest of today's reading, he's just reminding them what he first taught them about the resurrection and what they first believed about the resurrection. He says in verse 3, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Paul says this was of first importance because this is what Christianity is built upon, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. He died as our Messiah for the sins of the world, and the resurrection proved all of his claims were true about that. And so that is what built Christianity in the first place. It's not the Bible that built Christianity. It's not the New Testament writers that came along and invented this concept of a resurrection. It was the resurrection that created Christianity and then created the Bible, because the resurrection proved all of Jesus' claims were true, and it changed the lives of the apostles from these cowards to these courageous heralds of this good news, and they spread it throughout the world, and then they wrote about it in letters like this. The resurrection changed everything. It was so central and important, and because it was so important, Jesus made sure that his resurrection was made known to people, that it wasn't just some secret thing done in a corner somewhere, or maybe some hallucination by just a couple people with wishful thinking that he was still alive. No, he appeared to many different people on different occasions. Acts chapter 1 says Jesus was actually on the earth for 40 days after his resurrection, appearing to people with many convincing proofs of his resurrection to assure that this was real, that this actually happened. And Paul says, ultimately, Jesus appeared to me as one untimely born. I was a late comer to the scene. Jesus had already appeared to the other apostles way earlier, but it wasn't until years later, after I had been persecuting the church, that Jesus appeared to me, Paul's saying, on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9. And that is when he also finally got to see the resurrected Lord. And it's because of his persecution of the church and his coming late to the game that he views himself as the least of the apostles. He's so aware of his own sin and so eager now by the grace of God to live a different life. And so it's God's grace working in him, transforming him, propelling him to go forth and proclaim this gospel message, this good news of Jesus' resurrection. And that is the good news that the Corinthians received. And it's important that they remember that they believe that good news about Jesus' bodily resurrection, because that is going to play a key role in their acceptance of our bodily resurrection in the end. Now, let me make a couple practical applications here. First of all, our faith is not just based on feelings. It's not a blind faith. It's based on eyewitness testimony of Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' resurrection was not a hallucination, because 500 people don't have the same hallucination. And different people in different locations at different times, they don't have the same hallucination. It was not a legend that just developed gradually over time, because Paul, he references when he preached to them the first time this gospel message, well, that was around 51 AD. That was about 20 years after Jesus' resurrection. 20 years is not enough time for a legend to develop. I mean, it's the year 2024 now. If I told you the story of Jesus, there was a man claiming to be God, and he performed all these miracles, and the government put him to death, but he rose from the dead, and people claim that he rose from the dead. But that happened in the year 2004. You're like, what are you talking about? Like, we were alive then. That didn't happen. I never heard anything about that. So this is not enough time for a legend to develop. In fact, all scholars are in agreement, whether even atheist scholars of the Bible, they agree that verses 3 and 4 are a creedal encapsulation of the gospel message, which is just like a poetic way to summarize the gospel message that could be dated all the way back to like 2 or 3 years of Jesus' actual resurrection. So really, they were preaching the resurrection within years of Jesus' resurrection. That's not enough for a legend to develop. And scholars admit actually that creeds take years in order to develop, which means probably they were preaching the resurrection even sooner, within months, which is what Acts 2 tells us. Within 2 months, they were already preaching the resurrection. And 2 months is definitely not enough time for a legend to develop. So tons of evidence here for our faith. Paul even says in verse 6, those 500 brethren that Jesus appeared to, most of them are still alive. You can go double check me. You can go ask them. I love that. And then another application is, remember the grace of God. By the grace of God, we are what we are. We would be absolutely nothing without His grace and without the resurrection power of Jesus to transform our lives like it transformed Paul's. Let's have Paul's humility and see ourselves as the least of Christians because of our sins, but be grateful that God has transformed us and given us His grace to live a totally new life so that our labor for Him is not in vain. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 through 34. And remember, the Corinthians were denying that there's going to be a bodily resurrection in the end when Jesus comes back. And they're influenced by the Greco-Roman thought that the soul and the body are two separate things, and that ultimately in the end, there's either not going to be an afterlife at all, which is what some Greco-Romans believe, or if there is an afterlife, well then our soul is just going to shed our bodies like snakeskin, and our soul will live on forever, but our bodies will not be resurrected. And Paul says that is absolutely false. And the Corinthians, they are missing this connection that Paul is really going to drive home in this chapter. There is a connection or a direct link between Jesus' bodily resurrection from the grave and the final resurrection of our bodies from the grave. You cannot have one without the other, and to deny one is to deny the other. Now the Corinthians, they would not deny that Jesus was raised bodily from the grave. In fact, we saw in yesterday's reading, verses 1 through 11, that's what they put their faith in. That's what saved them initially. That's what the whole church in Corinth was built on, was their faith in the resurrection of Jesus. So they absolutely believe in Jesus' resurrection, but their problem is they're not believing in the final resurrection. And Paul says that's impossible. If you believe in Jesus' resurrection, you have to believe in the final resurrection of our bodies. And if you deny the possibility of our final resurrection in the end, then you're also denying the possibility of Jesus' resurrection. And that's what this first section from verse 12 to 19 is all about. 5 major problems with denying the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, he says, verse 14, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain. We're going around as apostles telling everybody to give their lives to Jesus because He's the Messiah, He resurrected from the dead. But then that's not rooted in reality if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, and so His preaching is vain. Your faith is in vain as well. Remember, their faith is built on the resurrection of Jesus, and without the resurrection, their faith is completely empty. It's completely pointless. He also says in verse 15, we would be considered liars because we're going around lying, telling people that God raised Jesus from the dead when He didn't actually do that. And then verse 17, which would be the fourth thing here, which I can't do with my fingers that way, okay? If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. Okay, if Jesus just allowed Himself to stay in the grave, well then His death would be no different from any of the other tens of thousands of people who were crucified by the Romans. But it's His resurrection that proved all of His claims to divinity, that proved that His claim that He was dying for our sins were true, and also it proved that He had victory over death, which is brought into the world by sin. So Jesus' resurrection was actually His victory over sin. And if He didn't have victory over sin in His life, well then we can't have victory over sin in ours. We're still trapped and lost in our sin. Number 5, verse 18, those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. It's basically just the end for them. If there's no resurrection, well then they're just going to rot in the grave forever. And so the conclusion here, verse 19, if our hope in Christ ends in this life. You know, we live our life and then we die, and that's the end of our hope in Christ, and we have absolutely no hope beyond the grave of being resurrected, then we should be pitied for believing in a delusion, for living some fantasy world, living in some fantasy world where we think that there's hope beyond the grave when there actually isn't. Okay, again, I don't think the Corinthians actually believe that Jesus didn't raise from the dead, but Paul is just trying to show them this link. If you deny the future resurrection, well then you're denying the past resurrection of Jesus. And if you do that, then your whole faith is vain. Now in the next section, from verse 20 to 28, Paul is going to show explicitly why Jesus' resurrection is linked to the final resurrection in the end. And that's because Jesus' resurrection was the inauguration, the start to the new creation and the restoration of all things, and the reversal of all of the damage and the curse caused by sin in the world. And so in verse 20, he calls Christ's resurrection the first fruits of those who are asleep, those who have died. First fruits, that draws on agricultural language from the Old Testament. If, for instance, you had a first crop of pear trees come in and you brought in some pears to sacrifice to the Lord as your first fruits, the first fruits was a sign of more pear trees to come. And when the later harvest of even more pear trees came, it would be just like the original pears that you brought. So it's not like you'd bring pears in as the first fruits, but then that was a sign of like an orange tree to come. Now that'd be kind of weird. Whatever your first fruits are, well, that's what the later harvest is going to be as well. So it's not like Jesus had a bodily resurrection as the first fruits, but then when we're resurrected, it won't be with a body, it will just be our souls living forever. That would be weird, because then the final harvest wouldn't look anything like the first fruits. And so the point is, Jesus had a resurrected body, and he was the first fruits, and when we're raised, we too are going to have a body in that resurrection. And the whole point of this is that Jesus is now reversing the curse of death that Adam brought into the world through sin. Because of Adam's sin, physical death was introduced to the world, but in Jesus, when he conquered death by rising bodily from the grave, he actually now is reversing that curse of death in the world. He overcame that, and eventually in the end, when all things have ended, Jesus comes back, that's when death will finally be put under his feet. Right now, people are still dying. But when Jesus comes back in the end, he'll have that final victory over death when everybody is resurrected from the dead. In that final resurrection, that's when Jesus finally crushes death once and for all. Death that's holding everybody in the grave right now, in the final day when Jesus returns, death will be releasing everyone's bodies from the grave, thus showing Jesus' victory over death, victory over sin, and victory really over all of the spiritual forces of wickedness. Satan and all of his demons, all things will be put under his feet. And Paul's kind of referencing a couple things here. Verse 25, he must reign until he's put all his enemies under his feet. That's probably a reference to Psalm 110, where God talks about his king and how he's going to put all things under the feet of his king and give his king dominion over all of his enemies. And then he quotes from Psalm 8 in verse 27, which is about God's plan to put human beings in charge and to have dominion over all of creation. And Jesus is really the human being. He's the model human being, right? Who serves as the forerunner to go before us and put all things under his feet so that he can have dominion over all of creation. This whole eschatology that Paul has, it's not just limited to our bodily resurrection. It's a restoration of all things. It's about subjecting all of creation under Jesus' feet. And once that happens, Jesus' work will have been accomplished, and he'll hand the kingdom back to the Father. And it says that the Father, God, will be all in all, which means he will have a completely uncontested reign. He would be totally sovereign over all the universe. There would be no wicked people. There would be no wicked demons, no Satan, no curse of sin or death or pain. Nothing that contests God's rule will be in existence anymore because of the power of Jesus' resurrection to reverse the curse of sin and show victory over Satan and all of sin and death. He's going to go more in detail about that later in this chapter, but that's why these two things are linked. Jesus' bodily resurrection gets the ball rolling on the reversal of sin and death and the restoration of all things to bring about the new creation in Christ. It's just an incredibly rich section here to show the power of Jesus' resurrection. Now, the last section here, in verses 29 to 34, Paul deals with some other practical problems with denying the resurrection in the end. First of all, your baptism is pointless. Verse 29, when we join Jesus in the waters of baptism, we're joining ourselves to his resurrection, which not only shows our faith in his past resurrection, but our hope in our future resurrection with him. And so if we don't believe that there is a resurrection of the dead in the end, well then our baptism is pointless. We're being baptized on behalf of dead people, essentially, which is absurd. We're being baptized for the benefit of people who are just going to be dead and who will have no life beyond the grave. And then Paul says, if there's no resurrection of the dead in the end, it makes no sense for him to have such a dangerous occupation as an apostle, to constantly be putting his body on the line and his life on the line, risking his life daily for the sake of the gospel. If he didn't have confidence that his body would be raised from the dead in the end, well, then he should be preserving his body. He should be focusing on keeping himself safe, because he only has this one life and there's no afterlife. And so he should focus on not only his own safety, but even just living a life of pleasure. He says, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, right? If we're just going to be worm food and there is no afterlife, then why in the world would he dedicate his life, A, to preaching a gospel that's based on a resurrection that never happened, okay, but B, why would he risk his life and put his body on the line if he doesn't have confidence that his body is going to be resurrected in the end? You should just live however you want to live, because we're all going to the same place in the end anyway. So whether you're righteous or wicked, it really doesn't matter in the end if there is no resurrection. Now, there's some question about the wording in verse 31. I think his point is just, I'm proud. You are my boasting, Corinthians, that I established the church there. But recognize, when I did that, I put my life on the line in order to do that. I risked my life, and there's no way I would have done that if I didn't have the hope of a resurrection in the end. And then there's also a question in verse 32 over the wild beast. Is that a literal thing? Was Paul actually fed to the animals and then God miraculously delivered him like he did with Daniel in the lion's den? Maybe. Or maybe it's just metaphorical to talk about the wicked people there that were in Ephesus. But either way, the point is the same. And in verse 33, this is fascinating, because usually when we use this verse, bad company corrupts good morals, we're talking about behavior. We're talking about, hey, you hang out with smokers and you're going to become a smoker. You hang out with drinkers, you're going to become a drinker. You hang out with people who cuss, you're going to cuss. Okay, that is true as well, but in this context, he's talking about hanging around people with wrong doctrinal views. And he says you hang around with people who have false views doctrinally about the gospel, and that can corrupt your views of the gospel as well. So you need to stay away from those people and be very careful. In verse 34, to stay sober-minded, okay, recognize the seriousness of this subject and don't get sucked in by people with false views. Stop sinning. He says, some have no knowledge of God. And that's the irony, right? The Corinthians, they're so puffed up on knowledge. We know all. We're so wise. And Paul's saying they don't even understand the most basic first principles of the gospel, which is the bodily resurrection of Jesus and the bodily resurrection of us in the end. And so he speaks to their shame. He's shaming them for this. Now, there's a couple applications that I want to finish with here. Number one, as Christians, we always need to be careful to trace out the implications of our beliefs. If we take a belief on something, a great way to test the validity of that belief is to just walk it out logically and see, okay, if I believe this, what are the logical implications of this? And they were not understanding the logical implications of denying the bodily resurrection in the end. They didn't see that that would actually have to then lead to the conclusion that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. And that's a disaster. So for instance, like the Mormons in verse 29, they take that as a vicarious baptism. They think that we can actually be baptized on behalf of dead people who have already long gone, and they didn't believe in Jesus when they were alive, but hey, we can get baptized for them so that they can be saved even beyond the grave. Okay, but trace the logical implications of that, and you're going to have all kinds of disasters. You're going to run into so many other problems with other scriptures. So we got to be very careful to trace the implications of our views, to test those views to make sure they make sense. And finally, I just want to say the resurrection is everything. It's the reason for our faith. It's the reason for our hope. It's the basis of our salvation. It's the reason why we live righteously, why we make sacrifices of our time and of our energy and our money and even of our very own lives. And without the resurrection, this entire life is completely pointless and vain. And I know atheists will try to claim, well, we can find our own meaning in life and we can do good for utilitarian reasons, for the good of society. And Paul's just trying to get us to see if there's no resurrection from the dead in the end and we're all just worm food, then everything is pointless. So let's thank God every day for the resurrection of Jesus, and let's use the resurrection as the impetus and the motivator for all things that we do in God's kingdom. I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 35 to 49, where Paul directly addresses some objections that have been raised to the resurrection of the dead in the end. Verse 35, someone will say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come? It's like because they can't understand or explain how the resurrection would work and what our bodies would look like, they just write off the resurrection as ridiculous. And Paul's frustrated by this. He says, you fool. These are not innocent objections raised by people that are actually interested in truth. These are people who are prideful and arrogant and puffed up in their knowledge, and they're just not taking the truth of the resurrection seriously. And they're asking basically, hey, what is that even going to look like? If we get a body in the resurrection, what are we going to be, zombies? If I was blind in this life, am I going to be blind then? If I lost an arm in this life, am I going to be armless? If I turned into dust, how is the dust going to become a body? They couldn't explain it, and so they just explained it away. And Paul says, that is foolish, because there are so many things in this life that you can't explain that are happening all around you. Miraculous transformations of bodies are actually taking place all over in the agricultural world. And here he compares the resurrection of our bodies to the resurrection of seeds. When you plant a seed in the ground, that seed decomposes in the ground like our bodies do, and out of that decomposition comes this glorious tree or this beautiful plant that you would never see coming. If you just looked at the outward appearance of that seed, it's just, it's like a naked seed. It's just bare, it's plain, it's modest. You would never think something so glorious could possibly come from that seed. And the same thing is true of our earthly bodies. When our earthly bodies decompose in the grave, when Jesus comes back, we're going to be given spiritual bodies that are incredibly glorious. And you can't tell what kind of glorious body we'll have just by looking at our natural bodies, because our glorious heavenly spiritual bodies will be different in nature than these bodies. Just like the glorious plant or tree that comes from the seed looks totally different from the seed that it came from. And by the way, that's not something that anybody in the first century world could explain. They couldn't tell you the mechanics of how all that worked. And even now with our advances in science, and we've got textbooks with photosynthesis descriptions and water, seed, and soil and how all that works, we still don't really know how that actually works. That's all ultimately assigned to the power of God. And the same thing is true about our resurrected bodies in the end. That's not something we're going to be able to explain how that works. We just know that's God's power. The possibility that He can raise us from the dead, that's nothing to God. He's the Creator. He can do all things. And what he now points out is that God has actually created many different kinds of bodies in this world. Humans and fish and birds and land animals, we all have various kinds of bodies, and they differ in glory and splendor. So if you watch a show like Planet Earth and you see all these amazing different bodies out in nature like chameleons, chameleons are incredibly glorious. They can change colors, right? They show the splendor of God in a marvelous way. But then you look over here at whales, and whales also are glorious because they're just so huge, and they too have their own kind of special glory. And then you've got koalas and pandas, and you've got sea anemones with spikes coming out, and octopi with 8 arms and tentacles. Everything is just so jaw-dropping when you look at these various bodies that God created in this world and how they all work and function. And each body is built for its particular environment. The same thing is true about heavenly bodies, Paul says. And here he means heavens in terms of the skies. So things like the sun and the moon and the stars, those all have bodies, right? Or forms that they take, and they differ in glory. Stars are very beautiful, they're very powerful, but then look at the sun. The sun is so much more powerful. It emanates so much more glory and splendor and light and energy. And each one of these bodies is perfectly suited for its purpose and perfectly suited for its environment. And the same thing is true when God gives us resurrected bodies. They too will be perfectly fitting for an eternal existence with God. But because of the curse of sin, our natural earthly flesh and blood bodies cannot handle that eternal existence, because sin has made these bodies corruptible and perishable and subject to death. And that's what he gets into in the next section, is the difference between our resurrected bodies and our current bodies. And he talks about how when our bodies currently are sown in the ground, he's going back to the agricultural analogy, when our bodies are buried and enter the grave, they do so as perishable, as subject to decay and sickness and death. But the resurrected body will not be subject to death. We'll never die again in the resurrected body. It's also sown in dishonor. Death is a dishonorable thing. We don't like to talk about it. It's kind of gross. We get dead people away from us as soon as possible. We want to bury them so that we don't have to look at them and even think about death, because death is so dishonorable. But the resurrected bodies, those will be glorious bodies. We won't have to look at the resurrected bodies in shame like we look at our dead bodies here. And then it's also sown in weakness. So these bodies are weak, subject to temptation, subject to aging and frailty and sickness and all of that. But our resurrection body won't have those same human weaknesses that these bodies do. Instead, we will have just full power from God. And then he says it's sown a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. What this means is it's not talking about the composition of the body necessarily, but what the body is empowered by. So our natural bodies, these originated and are empowered by the natural processes of this world. So for instance, people come from the birth process, the natural process of reproduction. That is where these bodies come from. And our bodies also are powered by the natural forces of like blood flow through the heart and air through the lungs. Now, it's certainly true, God is behind all that, right? God did breathe His Spirit into us in the beginning. That's true. He is, in some ways, the animating force, but we're also powered by this natural processes at the cellular level and all of the chemistry in our bodies that are making things go. That's not going to be the case with our resurrected bodies. Our resurrected bodies are completely powered by the Spirit of God, not powered by anything frail like our hearts or our lungs or our blood. None of that is what's empowering our resurrection bodies. That power comes solely from the Spirit of God, and therefore is not subject at all to any of the limitations or weaknesses or frailties or decay or death that our physical bodies are empowered by. Again, this is important because sometimes we think spiritual body and we think, oh, well, that means we're just going to be spirits that are disembodied. That's not true. We're going to have a body. There's going to be a material part of ourselves, but it won't be empowered by the flesh and blood natural processes that our current bodies are being kept alive by. And in this last section from 45 to 49, he talks about God's plan and the order in which He planned us having natural bodies versus these spiritual bodies. He goes all the way back to Adam in Genesis chapter 2, and it says that he became a living soul. Now, I understand what the New American Standard is trying to do there with that translation. It's just a little confusing, especially for us English readers, because it makes it sound like he's separating Adam's soul from his body or something like that, which would just be counter to this entire chapter. The point is, he became a living being. Other translations read that way. He became a living person. It's talking about his whole person. And the point is, God gave Adam a natural body designed for life in this natural world. Now, his body was not natural in the sense of coming from the natural reproductive processes of other human beings, because that would be impossible. In Adam's case, he was the first human. But he was given a natural body in the sense that God used the natural world as part of the ingredients to create him. He used the dust of the earth to create Adam. He gave him a flesh and blood body with a heart and lungs and blood and all of that. But Jesus, as the last Adam, it is true he had a natural body while he was here on the earth, dying for our sins, but after his death, burial, and resurrection, well, now he's given a spiritual body. But what's interesting is Paul calls Jesus a life-giving spirit here. That also throws us off, because it makes it sound like he doesn't have a body, he's just a spirit floating around. That's not what Paul's saying. Here's the point. When God created Adam and gave him that natural body, the true power source behind Adam's body was not really his heart and his lungs and his blood. The true power source was God's Spirit. God breathed His Spirit into the nostrils of Adam. That is what animated him and gave him life. And what Paul's saying is, now that Jesus has been resurrected from the grave, it's like He becomes the new power source for our resurrected bodies. That in the end, after our current bodies have decomposed in the grave, when Jesus comes back, it's like He's going to then breathe God's Spirit into our nostrils again and recreate our bodies and give us these newly empowered, resurrected bodies empowered by His Spirit. He's kind of answering the question that they asked him earlier in verse 35. How are the dead raised? How are they raised? By the power of Jesus' resurrection. That is what becomes the life force for our resurrected bodies. And there's a cool contrast because Adam, the first Adam, he received life from God's Spirit. But Jesus, by the power of what he accomplished on the cross and at his resurrection, he actually becomes the giver of life. He gives us life by God's Spirit. Adam received life. Jesus imparts life. He's a much better Adam, right? And he's going to give us much better bodies in the end. Verse 46, however, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. So Adam came first and then Jesus. That means we're still in the seed stage right now. We're not really given our spiritual bodies yet. That's something that we look forward to in the future. But right now, we're still in our natural, carnal bodies. Verse 47, the first man is from the earth. That's Adam. He's earthy. Jesus, he was not from the earth. He did not have a natural earthly body. He was up in heaven, and his body, his form was of heavenly origin. And so likewise, right now, we're like the first Adam in our carnal bodies, but then because of what Jesus has done for us, then we're going to be given a heavenly body like he had. Verse 48, as is the earthy, so also are those who are earthy. As is the heavenly, so also are those who are heavenly. I think the point here is, even in our carnal bodies right now, we can make a choice of what kind of body we're going to have in the resurrection. If we are carnal and earthly and natural in our thinking, which by the way the Corinthians were, then we're aligning ourselves with Adam. And our bodies are just going to be subject to decay and to the penalty of death for sin. But if we align ourselves with Jesus and we focus on heavenly things and we become spiritually minded people, well then we're aligning ourselves with the spiritual heavenly body. And we're going to have a hope that in the resurrection, we're going to be resurrected to life. But it's our choice now. And this is the idea of when we get baptized, we're actually joining ourselves to the resurrection of Jesus. And we receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. It's like Jesus has already breathed new life into us spiritually by the power of His Spirit, by the power of His resurrection. And so we get a foretaste already. Even though we're just in our carnal earthly bodies right now, we can get a foretaste in Jesus of that final resurrected body. We should be living as if we're in our resurrected bodies already. Now, verse 49, finally, we have borne the image of the earthly. Because we are Adam's descendants, we bear his image, right? We're made in the flesh and, flesh and blood bodies and all of that. But we have the hope one day of bearing the image of Jesus and having a spiritual body like he does. Just a couple quick applications at the end. First of all, we need to be careful thinking just because I don't understand how something works and I don't really grasp all the mechanics, that it's not real or that it's not actually going to happen in the future. So for instance, sometimes we've done this with the Holy Spirit where there's a lot of confusing passages about the Holy Spirit, and because we don't understand the mechanics of how the Spirit works, sometimes we just put the Spirit in a box and we say, well, the Holy Spirit, that's just the Word, and He doesn't do anything apart from the Word, and we just discount it and say, well, there's no way the Spirit is working in people's lives that way because I don't really understand how to explain it. We've got to be very careful doing that. We need to humble ourselves and recognize all things are possible with God. We need to let God's Word just speak for itself and not try to put it in boxes just because those boxes make it easier for us to understand it. Sometimes I get some pushback on the New Heavens, New Earth view that I take as well because people say, well, I don't really know what that will look like. I don't really understand exactly how it's going to work, and they start making up all kinds of crazy scenarios like, oh, you're saying there's going to be mosquitoes in heaven and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, just because you don't understand the mechanics, that doesn't change the language of Scripture. We just need to wrestle with what God says in His Word about it. And secondly, we need to align ourselves with Jesus and not with Adam. When we think carnally and naturally like the world around us and we allow the thinking of our culture to creep into our hearts and minds, we're living like the Corinthians, first of all, and we're also living like Adam. We're associating ourselves with Adam, and therefore we are going to be subject to decay and ultimately death and decomposition and then final judgment in the end. But if we align ourselves with Jesus and we think spiritually and we prioritize the things that He prioritizes and we love each other and we sacrifice for each other for the sake of our brethren, those are the things that then will give us the hope that one day we will have a spiritual body like Jesus, that He will give us new life in the resurrection to come. Hope that's helpful, and I'll see you tomorrow. Well, we're in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 50 to 58, and Paul finishes this chapter with a bang because he says that the resurrection of the dead in the end is going to be the ultimate stamp of victory over Satan and over death and over sin and over the way that Satan had twisted God's law against human beings to bring the curse of sin and death into the world. And this all makes sense when you go back in your thinking to the garden. Think about when God created Adam and Eve. He created human beings with a material part and an immaterial part, a body and a soul, and He unites them together so that Adam becomes a living being or person, which he quoted from earlier in this chapter from Genesis 2:7. And then Satan comes along and he uses God's law against them, the law about the forbidden fruit. And he tells them, hey, you're not going to die if you eat that. They sin, they disobey, they break God's law, and then the curse of sin, one of the curses, is death. And if you think about it, death actually leads to the separation now of the body and soul, of the material and the immaterial parts of humanity. We sort of become split. So you can have righteous people like Noah or Abraham or Moses, and they're right with God spiritually, but their body is now, because of the curse of sin, still subject to decay and to the inevitable return to the dust, where we will rot in the grave. And then even though they're righteous and their souls are with God, their bodies are still in the grave. And so this is not what God had in mind at all. He wanted human beings to be united as a material and an immaterial part, a body and a soul. But sin separates all that. But in the resurrection from the grave, in the end, when Jesus comes back, that curse of sin is going to be reversed, and our bodies are going to be changed and reunited with our spirits. And this is going to be why it's the ultimate death blow to death itself and to sin itself, and ultimately to Satan, who is responsible for introducing all of the sin and the death in this world. Verse 50, he says, though, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So when our bodies are reunited with our spirits, it's not just going to be our flesh and blood bodies that we had before we died. That's not going to work. We're going to need different bodies altogether, which he's already talked about in this chapter, not natural bodies, but spiritual, glorified bodies, so that we can live eternally with God, because these flesh and blood bodies are subject to decay and to death and to rotting in the grave because of the curse of sin. Verse 51, I tell you a mystery. A mystery just means something that God has to reveal to us, something human beings could not know on their own, something God had to tell us, that we'll not all sleep, but we will all be changed. So Paul doesn't know when Jesus is going to come back, but he does know when Jesus does come back, not all Christians will have died. There will be some Christians who are still alive, but whether you have already died or you're still alive, you're still going to need a new body. You still can't enter into God's heavenly eternal kingdom with flesh and blood. You're still going to need that transformation. And when Jesus comes back, we're all going to be changed. We're all going to be transformed. He may be drawing this changed language from Psalm 102 in verse 26, which really describes what happens to the entire cosmos. The heavens and the earth will all be changed, will all be transformed. The image he uses there is changed like a garment. And it is like we're going to be given a new body, a changed body, clothed with something different, something eternal and imperishable. And it's going to happen instantaneously, verse 52, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. That word twinkling in the Greek, it means stroke or beat, like the beat of an eye. So it's probably more a reference to blinking. Maybe twinkling there is the idea of just the light reflecting off your eye very quickly. Or maybe when you blink, it's like it cuts off the light and then it lets light back in again, and there's sort of a twinkle when that happens. So the point is, it just happens instantaneously. It's like a blink of an eye. This is not going to be some long, drawn-out process. When Jesus comes back, instant change is going to take place, and everybody is going to be resurrected. Interestingly, in John chapter 5, Jesus says all people, the righteous and the wicked, will have a bodily resurrection. That the righteous, when our bodies are changed, we will then enter into the resurrection to life, where we'll live with God forever. Whereas the wicked, they too, their bodies also will be transformed. Why? Because flesh and blood can't inherit eternity. And so even wicked people will not be able to spend eternity in hell in flesh and blood bodies. Wicked people will also need different bodies, incorruptible, imperishable bodies that never die, so that they will be in eternity in hell. It's kind of a scary thought, But I did want you to know that the power of Jesus' resurrection doesn't just raise the righteous people's bodies from the grave, it raises the wicked people's bodies from the grave. Now, I will say in this chapter, though, Paul really is focusing mainly on the resurrection of the righteous because he's writing to Christians and he's trying to give the Christians hope here. His point really isn't to focus on the resurrection of the wicked in this chapter. But I do want to point that out as the power of Jesus' resurrection to resurrect everybody. And so he says all will be changed. Well, that's not just Christians, that's everybody. Everybody will receive a transformed body. And this is going to happen when the trumpet sounds. That reminds us of 1 Thessalonians 4. The trumpet always represented, the presence of God in almost like a rallying cry for God's people to come to him. In verses 53 and 54, he uses that put on language. It's that clothing language, that we're going to be clothed with a new kind of body, kind of like putting on a new garment. And earlier I said that we're going to receive new bodies. I just need to clarify that. I don't mean by that God is done with our old bodies. No, he's going to raise our old flesh and blood bodies from the grave, but that he's going to transform our old bodies and make them new with a totally new kind of quality, an imperishable quality. It's kind of like Revelation 21 and verse 5 that talks about God's future plans for everything. It doesn't say that he's going to make all new things. It says he's going to make all things new. So it's not like God just scraps our old bodies and says, I'm going to give them completely new bodies. I'm going to make all new bodies. No, he's going to take the old bodies and make the old bodies new, imperishable, able to live with him forever, like a fresh change of clothes, a new garment that hasn't been ruined by sin. At the end of verse 54 and into verse 55, he quotes from Isaiah 25 and Hosea 13. And there's a section from Isaiah 24 all the way to 27. If you read that section, it's so fascinating because God comes in judgment and wrath against the wicked inhabitants of the earth, but he saves his people from death. He resurrects his people from the grave. And as a part of that, in chapter 27 of Isaiah, he actually throws the dragon into the heart of the sea. He's bringing down punishment on the serpent that brought death into the world. It's a picture that's repeated in Revelation, where at the end, when Jesus comes back, Satan himself, the dragon of old, he is cast into the lake of fire. But not only is Satan cast into the lake of fire, death itself is cast into the lake of fire. Death itself is judged by God. And so death is then swallowed up. In victory, when people are resurrected, it shows that death can't hold God's people in the grave anymore. Death has no more power. Death has been completely judged. And that's why ultimately life and resurrection and God himself have the last laugh against death. And it is a laugh. It's a taunt when he quotes from Hosea, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" It's mocking death, mocking sin's power, because it has no more power in the end when we're resurrected. He says the sting of death is sin. It's like death is a venomous scorpion. And when we sin, it's like we're being stung by death. And death is injecting us with this venom that then leads to our decay and our death and our rotting in the grave. And the thing that gives that stinger so much power and sin so much power is God's law. This holy, perfect standard that none of us have lived up to, and that says in the law, if we break God's law, the penalty for it is death. But the beautiful thing is Jesus came to deal with the sin problem by taking the death that we owed by law upon himself. Now, when we sin can no longer hold us in the grave because we no longer owe God death for our sin. Jesus forgives us of all of our sins, and then he conquered the grave at his resurrection. He conquered death so that now when we put our faith in him and we serve him, we too don't have to be kept in the grave by our sins. Our sins can be taken care of, and then we can be resurrected and conquer the grave just like Jesus did. And that's why Paul says, thanks be to God for the victory that we have through him. Now, it is true, we're still going to die physically. Our bodies are still going to go back to the grave. So God is allowing death to still have some sting, right? Some temporary victory. But earlier in verse 26, remember, he says death is the last enemy to be defeated. So the idea is we're still, yes, going to be suffering from decay and death and rot in the grave, but that's only temporary, and that is not meant to be our end. In the end, death will be defeated, God will win, sin will be destroyed forever, we will be with God forever, and that is all made possible in Jesus. A couple quick applications at the end here. Verse 58, great application verse. Because of the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection that we look forward to in the end, our life matters. Nothing we do here is pointless. It all has purpose and meaning. This is kind of the antidote to the book of Ecclesiastes, because there Solomon laments the meaninglessness, the pointlessness of life under the sun, because he's imagining life on this earth without a life beyond this one. It's like what Paul said earlier in this chapter. If there is no life beyond this one, well, then we might as well just eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. What is the point of any of it? But the resurrection answers the book of Ecclesiastes and says life is not limited to just underneath the sun. Jesus' resurrection gives us hope of a life beyond. And that means every single thing we do in our service to God matters. So stay faithful. Don't get discouraged. Don't give up. Don't allow the world to pull you away from Jesus like the Corinthians were. They were allowing the world to pull them away from one of the most basic, fundamental doctrines of Christianity, the resurrection, the very thing that gives life meaning. And then secondly, know that God, by resurrecting our bodies, He's showing victory over Satan. If He left our bodies in the grave, but then He said, well, I'll just let their spirits live on forever, well, then that's allowing Satan to corrupt his plan, because his plan was that the material and the immaterial would be united in human beings. And if He let Satan just split humans into two for all eternity, and God said, well, I'm just done with those bodies. I'm just scrapping those bodies and they'll just be spirits from now on. Then Satan actually destroyed the bodies that God gave us, defeating God. And God says, you're not going to have the last word. You're not destroying my body. You're not going to destroy my plan. I am going to reunite the material and the immaterial. I'm going to win. So if God wins, He's the one that we need to be serving. He's the one whose side we need to be on. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, we're in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 11 today. And remember, the last thing Paul said in the last chapter is that because of the resurrection of the dead and our hope of being raised by Jesus in the end, everything we do matters. Nothing is in vain, and therefore continue to abound in the work of the Lord. Well, now he talks about a specific work of the Lord, and that is the collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem. And he starts with now concerning, which means they have written to him asking him about this collection, which also means they already knew about this collection, probably because Paul wrote to them about it in his earlier letter that we don't have. And now they're just asking, okay, how do we go about doing this? Do we wait till you get here and then we collect it? And Paul's telling him, no, here's how you go about doing it. I want you to collect it on the first day of the week when you come together. That's when the churches in the first century gathered, was on the first day of the week. That's the Lord's Day. That's when the Lord was resurrected from the grave. That's when they would all be together, and that's the most convenient time then to pool their money and put it together for this collection. So when Paul comes, all that money will have already been collected and ready to go. They won't have to then, do things at the last minute and try to scrounge to find money when Paul gets there. They'll actually have this ready to go and prepared. It'll be a purposeful giving for this occasion. Now, we'll talk much more about the significance of that Jerusalem collection later, because Paul's going to bring it up again in 2 Corinthians 8, 2 Corinthians 9, Romans 15, Acts 24, because this was a large goal that Paul had on his third missionary journey, was to go around to Gentile churches and collect money for the needy Christians in Jerusalem. Those Christians struggled a lot in the first century from famines, from persecution, maybe from Jews that came 3 times a year to Jerusalem, and if they became Christians, well, then it was kind of like a repeat of Acts 2, and you had an overflow of Christians trying to live and work and worship together, and they needed money to make that work. But this is part of what Paul's trying to accomplish, and just think about how amazing it is that Paul's writing to Gentile churches. They're in Corinth, but also in Galatia. They would have some Jews there in the churches as well, but largely these are Gentile churches, and he's asking them to collect money for Jews. Nobody in the first century world would do that. Jews, Gentiles, they would not take up financial collections to help each other. But that is the power of the gospel, that even enemies who hated each other like the Jews and Gentiles did are willing to make sacrifices and give financially to help each other. That is an amazing transformation in the lives of these Gentiles, that they would be willing now to take up this collection to help their brethren in Jerusalem and say, we're Gentiles, they're Jews, but we're all one in Christ. It really is amazing. And Paul is wise about this money situation, because he's not sure after he visits them if he's going to be able to go to Jerusalem. And so he says, if I'm not able to go to Jerusalem to take this collection myself, well then you appoint trusted brethren, and I'll write them letters to show the Jerusalem church that this is a legitimate offering, this is really coming from the church in Corinth. You can trust that this is an act of fellowship and unity between us. But Paul says, if it's fitting for me in my circumstances to go to Jerusalem, well then send some brethren with me and we'll all go together. So I love how Paul doesn't say, just give me the money and trust me with it. Money's a sensitive subject with Paul and the Corinthians, and he wants to make sure none of them can accuse him of, taking their money and going on a shopping spree and maybe spending 50% of it and giving the other half to the Jerusalem Christians. He wants to make sure he's got a lot of accountability around him. And so he's got other brethren that the Corinthians trust to go with him on this trip. Now, in verses 5 through 9, he gets into his specific travel plans because he's already told them he plans to come see them. But now he gets into specifics. And if you look on a map, Paul is in Ephesus currently. And what Paul's saying here is, my plan now is to go up north and then kind of northwest into Macedonia before I come see you. And remember, that's where these other churches of the Philippians and the Thessalonians and the Bereans, that's where they are. So Paul wants to go and visit them. And then he wants to come to Corinth. But before he even goes on that journey, he wants to stay in Ephesus for a little while longer. He says at least until Pentecost. So it's springtime right now, and he wants to stay there until sort of the end of spring, maybe early summer, and then make his travels to Macedonia and then down south into Corinth. And that's because there's an effective door that's been opened to him in Ephesus. It's been a while since we've looked in Acts 19. But we're going to go back to Acts 19 next week, Lord willing. But we did get through verse 10. And even in Acts 19, verse 10, it says, many people believed there in Ephesus. So there was success in that town. Now, there were also adversaries. He's going to run into some problems. Demetrius the silversmith's going to give him problems. He mentioned in the last chapter fighting against wild beasts at Ephesus, whether that was literal or figurative. Some difficulties there. But the gospel is largely going to flourish in Ephesus. That's why he's going to stay in Ephesus for 3 years, longer than he stayed anywhere else. But he says, before I finish up, before I come to you, I want to finish up in Ephesus and continue the work here, and then I'll come to you from Macedonia down south to your location. The reason this is important is because Paul is actually changing his travel plans here. And that's because in his earlier letter, the letter that we do not have, he gave a different travel plan. And we know this because he's going to mention this in 2 Corinthians 1. This is why I'm spending so much time here, because this is going to come up again. In the first chapter of 2 Corinthians, his original plan, plan A, was to come from Ephesus straight across the sea to Corinth. But now he's changing that to plan B, and he's saying, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to you and then go to Macedonia and then come back down to you. No, I want to now stay in Ephesus a little longer because things are going so well, and then I want to go to Macedonia and then come to you. So this is plan B. And the reason that's important is because they're going to accuse Paul of being wishy-washy and use that as an argument against his apostleship and his legitimacy, saying you can't trust Paul. He makes promises and then he doesn't keep them. He makes plans and then he just doesn't follow through and commit. And Paul's going to address that in 2 Corinthians, and we'll get into that in chapter 1, Lord willing, when we're there pretty soon. Verses 10 and 11 now, Paul expects that this letter will arrive before Timothy does. He has actually sent Timothy, the book of Acts will tell us, he's going to send Timothy and Erastus up through Macedonia, and then eventually down to Corinth. But he thinks this letter is going to arrive before Timothy, probably because he's going to send this letter by the hands of the men mentioned in verse 17, Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus. They're going to take this letter straight across the sea to Corinth, and Paul wants to make sure when Timothy arrives, they receive him well. And that's because I think Paul has a sneaking suspicion that this letter is not going to be received well by the Corinthians. The Corinthians are going to be angry at Paul for this letter because of his rebuke of all of their sinful behavior. And Paul's concerned they're going to take their anger against him out on Timothy when he arrives. And he wants to make sure they're ready to receive and respect Timothy as they would receive and respect Paul himself, because Timothy is going to be like Paul's representative. Now, when we get to 2 Corinthians, Paul's suspicions are going to be confirmed. They are not going to receive this letter well at all. And we're going to talk more about that when we get there, but let me finish with a few applications. First of all, notice where this money came from. It came from the free will offerings of Christians. It didn't come from soliciting their non-Christian visitors. It didn't come from going out in the community and hosting bake sales and car washes or selling raffle tickets to raise money from the non-Christian community around them. No, this came from Christians. And notice it was also sent to Christians. It was sent to the needy saints in Jerusalem. And this is what we see all throughout the New Testament, that whenever the churches collected their funds, it was to support other Christians. It wasn't to support non-Christians. So they're not taking this money out into their community and just handing out money door to door to their non-Christian friends and neighbors. They're not just using this money to support underdeveloped neighborhoods in the area. No, they're giving to Christians. Now, individually, we can absolutely use our money to help non-Christians in different scenarios, but whenever you see the church collecting money in the New Testament, it was always either one, to support gospel preachers, number two, to support the work going on in that particular location, to help the church there locally to thrive and to flourish, but then three, to help Christians in other locations, like they're doing here in this text, helping the Christians in Jerusalem. And thirdly, we see wisdom about how to handle money, that you shouldn't put one person in charge of the money. That's what I appreciate about our congregation. Whenever we take up a contribution, there's always more than one person in charge of counting that money. Usually it's two people, not one, and those people rotate so that it's not the same two people every time. And that's a great idea because number one, it keeps you from putting someone in a tempting situation, because if you have one person back there and they're tempted to steal, they could just skim some off the top. Nobody would ever know necessarily. But if you got more than one person back there, well, then you can keep each other accountable. And also it guards against false accusations. If there's some miscount that happens, somebody might accuse you of having stolen something, and that's why it was miscounted, and there's some discrepancies with your numbers. But if you got more than one person back there, and especially if those people are rotating and it's not the same two people each time, it just guards against those kind of situations and keeps everything above board. I hope that's helpful. I'll see you on Monday.